Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and special thanks to Louisa and Yvonne for inviting me along to talk. I'm very, very pleased to be here, particularly since I'm very much a novice when it comes to Igbo studies, but I've been learning a lot today, and I look forward to continuing to learn. My work has over the recent years has been more focused on Sierra Leone, but through an archive, which I'd like to talk about, I've been really introduced to Nigeria. So I want to take the opportunity to tell you about a particular project which is the subject of a 3-year research project that's just begun, which ties in very much with the themes of the conference today: memory, culture, community, and particularly this thinking about archives and collections. But more than anything, what I'd like to do is to really issue a most sincere invitation to everyone here to get involved in this research. You've had a lot of invitations today to contribute to this and contribute to that. Well, here's another one, because this project is intended very much to be a participatory kind of a project around this particular archive. As I'll be kind of mentioning later, we tend to assume that institutions like museums and universities and archives and so on somehow are the keepers of expert knowledge. These are the authoritative kind of locations of knowledge. But of course, what we recognize is that those institutions, and they'll be very open to acknowledging this, often know very little about the things that they're responsible for caring for. And the collection, the archives that I'd want to talk to you this afternoon about fall very much into this category. So it's not that these institutions are the source of knowledge. They are keepers of collections which, as it were, that knowledge is implicit. And that invitation really is to invite you to participate in actually contributing to our knowledge about this archive. Before I kind of come on to talk more specifically about that, I just want to unpack my title here, which is also the title of the project, Re-Entanglements, just a little bit. I could give a terms lecture or a course on this, of course, and I thought I'd just snap a few covers of books, which in some sense is off my bookshelf, which shape some of the thinking here. I'll only mention these very briefly to give some kind of context to this. What are these entanglements that we're talking about? So firstly, the entanglement between people and things, okay? And we've already, particularly in the last session, heard about that, how our senses of identity are bound up with those archives, those things under the bed or in the attic and so on. The way in which we're shaped, as it were, through the things that we possess or that surround us and so on. So there's a whole sphere of anthropological studies called material culture studies, which is concerned with this relationship. We readily think that people make things, but one of the arguments of that area of studies is that we're also made through things. Things make people. So that's one of those kind of entanglements. In the history of anthropology, another entanglement is that things, and I'm using things very broadly here, not just objects, but things in a broader sense, have been used to gather knowledge to know other people, okay? And we can immediately think of anthropology and its entanglement with colonialism, the colonial project, and this, you'll see, will be relevant to the archive I want to talk about. Anthropology as a discipline began its life really as a museum discipline and then migrated to the university. And it was very much through things, the collecting of things, that the idea was that you would know the people through their things. These are the things that could be transported, as it were, into museums and so on, and through them knowledge could be produced. So those kinds of entanglements, of course, change over time. So the archive I'll be talking about involves certain types of entanglement that happened in the early 20th century, very much within the colonial context, very problematic, therefore, because this is knowledge, things assembled, knowledge assembled through a colonial practice. But one of the questions is, well, what does that material by virtue of it being institutionalized, put in museums, put in archives, put in libraries, it's now 100 years since it's been collected. What does that mean now? What does it do now? How are we differently entangled with that material today? And so what this project, which I'd like to talk about, involves, is trying to think about that, how these political entanglements with objects, knowledge, photography, this anthropological project in a colonial era, what was that intended to do, as it were, in the past? And what, 100 years later, what can it do today? Okay, and I'm mindful very much of our subtitle for the conference, which is not only about the past, but thinking about the relationship of the past in terms of how we imagine the future, which, of course, has been very much a topic of the day's discussion. Another kind of big area of anthropological study is around this issue of memory. How does societies remember? You know, and again, we've spoken a little about individual memory or family memory in some of the papers in the last session. And can societies be said to remember in some way? And, you know, a number of people have mentioned how language is integral to this and the kind of thing. So one of the questions is what are the means through which societies remember? And we can readily think of institutions like the archive. Here's the National Archives in Enugu, for instance, a site of memory, as it were. And of course, these are also entangled because the archive, as an institution like this, is very much a production of that kind of colonial heritage, if you like. It's a very particular form of remembering, and Nathan drew our attention to the fact that all archives have gaps, and of course the gaps are much bigger than the things that are actually included. They are spaces of silences much more than they are of voices, if you like. What kinds of knowledge got encoded in the colonial archive? Other kinds of sites of memory we could think about, of course, museums. Here's a photograph of the Igbo family compound in the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, for instance. So this is where material culture is used very much as an underpinning of the stories we tell about the past and so on. So these are familiar kinds of institutional spaces of memory. But of course there are many other kinds of ways of remembering. As I mentioned, a lot of my work has been in Sierra Leone, and I always am drawn to this example. In the north of Sierra Leone in particular, you have these kind of ancestral shrines, which are often very modest kinds of things, collections of stones in particular, and Boromasar, the house of stones. And when someone dies, a stone is placed on this pile of other stones, and people will give gifts and make sacrifices and so on at these sites. And for perhaps several years, people will know which was the stone belonging to which ancestor. But over time, of course, the specificity of the identity of each stone is lost. They lose their names and their particular associations. So the site becomes a more general ancestral kind of shrine. And these are often forgotten about these days, but nevertheless, particularly elders and so on will take you to these kinds of places. And as you can see in the bottom left here, a photograph taken by a man named Northcote Thomas, which I want to talk about in particular, recording one of these sites in northern Sierra Leone in 1914. And of course, coming closer to home, as it were, in Igbo country, we're familiar with other ways of remembering, particularly the presencing of ancestors, which we've heard about, particularly in the first keynote, which links very closely to some of this. More performative ways. So we've heard about how masquerade performance is also a kind of invocation of the past, of the particular ancestral presences, and so on. But I want to be cautious about making too clear a distinction between, these colonial institutional types of memory, like archive offices or museums, and these authentic, traditional, indigenous forms of memory, such as masquerade or ancestral shrines. And partly that's because, of course, what I've been showing you are photographs. These are in themselves now a kind of a mnemonic technology, the photographs. These photographs taken in 1910, 1912, 1914, and so on, are of course now also part of this heritage. And they, as it were, are often we heard from Chadikobi mentioning this, how, collecting together these old photographs actually become the source, in a way, of our knowledge about some of these traditions. And of course, anthropologists have been very much concerned over more than 100 years with collecting these traditional practices. So there's another entanglement there about the way in which we remember, and to divorce those kind of authentic indigenous from the colonial or the post-colonial, the mediated, is, I think, a mistake. It's a messy, entangled thing. Anyway, I'll probably already fast using up my time. Let me come on to talk about this man then. This is Northcote Thomas, and we've been looking at some of his photographs. He has a footnote in the history of anthropology as being the first anthropologist, professional anthropologist, who was appointed by the British Colonial Office as a government anthropologist. And there's a whole story to his appointment and his kind of own biography, which I won't go into now. But in the course of his role, and he had a rather sad career from an anthropological point of view, he really was only a professional anthropologist for 6 years. After a series of tours in southern Nigeria and Sierra Leone, he more or less disappeared off the scene, partly because anthropology moved on and he represented what had become an old-fashioned mode of doing research. But anyway, in the course of this role as a government anthropologist, so I'm wanting to foreground that this is part of a colonial project, of course, he conducted 4 surveys in southern Nigeria and Sierra Leone. One focused on Edo-speaking communities centered around Benin City, 2 in Igbo-speaking territories, one centered around what was then Orca district and the other Asaba district, and largely because of Lugard's distaste for academics generally, he then moved to Sierra Leone to conduct the 4th and final of these tours, which coincided with the outbreak of the First World War, which cut the budgets, which meant he didn't do any more. Now, because of today's focus on the Igbo thing, I'll be focusing on his 2 Igbo tours. So 1910 to 11 and 1912 to 13, so over 100 years ago now. And I've been mapping the kinds of places where he was working. And this is it wasn't as if he had a list of his itinerary. This is in itself part of a research project, because reassembling those itineraries that he made is often finding scraps of notes and things like this here and there. The first of those tours in Igbo country was focused around Orca district, which I'll move away from the thing. So it was tightly clustered around here. The second one was supposed to be focused on Asaba district, but he also spent 3 months then travelling around, as you can see, further south and further east, stopping at some of the other places. So he covered quite a large area. And if you're interested, I've created, there's a website for this project, reentanglements.net, and on there there's a series of Google Maps. So if you're interested in pinpointing, where did he actually go in some of those places, you can have a look on those Google Maps, because you can scale in and out of them. And I've put a sample photograph from many of those places. So maybe you've got family connections in some of those places. That would be really interesting to hear from you about. So do go and have a look at that. Here's the man, as it were, in a very carefully orchestrated photograph the government anthropologist at a meeting of chiefs to discuss a land dispute. And I suspect this photograph was taken, or Thomas had it taken, to prove to the people who were paying him, that's the colonial government, that he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, okay? Doing anthropological research. It was supposed to engage with things like land disputes and things like this, something that was practically useful. Because one of the criticisms that the colonial governments had of him, that the kinds of knowledge that he was producing was really academic. It had no value in colonial governance, which is what they thought that they were employing an anthropologist to do, to help in this project of indirect rule. A lot of the material that he actually was finding out, people couldn't figure out, well, how do we apply this? What usefulness is it? Which is a constant gripe that the colonial government, for instance, in southern Nigeria had, is that this isn't worth the money it's costing us because we can't use this knowledge. But we could, again, do a whole deconstruction of just this photograph of the chiefs, the position of the colonial anthropologist center, the interpreters, his assistants, the whole kind of thing. It's a fascinating piece of kind of colonial documentation, in a way, of the colonial project. But one of the interesting things about Thomas being a bit of an old-fashioned anthropologist, even in his own time, was that he was applying, let's call it a mode of field work that involved primarily collecting and documenting, okay? So whereas a subsequent generation of anthropologists were all about the analysis, as it were, and they didn't make huge collections or take thousands of photographs in the way that Thomas did, he was very much creating an encyclopedic database, if you like, of the communities in which he was working. And this affords something very interesting, because all of that stuff, actually, this was seen as a failed project at the time. And all of that stuff then just got shelved, effectively, put in a museum, put in an archive. It didn't get used in the way it was intended to be used. But of course, what's happened is that we can revisit that material. 100 years on, we can actually look at it. And actually, in the space of 100 years, no one's really looked at this until now. So I just want to talk you through and give you some examples of the kinds of things in this archive. And I use the word archive to refer to material culture collections, photographs, sound recordings, and so on. So here are some of the photographs that Thomas took of objects, artifacts that he was collecting. And he collected thousands of artifacts. He's numbering them here. He's getting ready to ship them to Cambridge. They're now held at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. And here's some photographs. These are actually objects from Edo-speaking areas. You can see some of this is from Benin, for instance. One interesting thing to point out is that Thomas either commissioned or paid for the collections he made, okay? So in contrast to that idea, particularly associated with the colonial loot narrative around, say, the looting of Benin City, the British Museum didn't want these things precisely because he was commissioning them to be made. So there's a whole politics to that, of course. Most of them look like this now. They're in storage boxes. They haven't been examined. They're not on display. Okay, they're there. They're an archive, an inaccessible archive. And through this project, we're hoping to look at these objects anew. What is it that he's collected? What is the significance? Often, the extent of the information, this is his catalogue here, is one brief description of what these objects are. So there's a lot of knowledge missing about these kind of objects. And again, this is why I'm inviting you to participate. Occasionally, we'll find one of his field photographs, this mask, for instance, which was collected in Nibo, I think, in 1911, and we can see the mask today in the museum. And this is the one object of his that is actually on display in the museum in Cambridge. He also collected botanical specimens, okay, for Kew. And again, he was just this encyclopedic collector in a way. So what do these represent now? He collected the local names of these. He had them identified by botanists at Kew. He collected knowledge about what they were used for. But of course, they also represent a snapshot, if you like, of biodiversity in the areas in which he worked 100 years ago. So there's the opportunity to go back into those areas and see from a kind of an environmental point of view, well, you know, what has changed? What could one make these collections today, for instance? He recorded hundreds of sound recordings. I found one photograph he took, you know, as I'll come on to say, he took over 7,000 photographs. And I found one in which we can see a picture of his phonograph recorder there. And these were recorded on wax cylinders. This is from Agala or Gila. I'll play you a very quick clip of this precise recording session. Okay, we know on the 4th of June 1913, he took this photograph and he made this recording.
Agala, June the 4th, 1913.
I'll keep it short because I'll run out of time. But hundreds of recordings like this. Sometimes, so he was recording samples of speech for linguistic analysis. He recorded stories, songs, music. Here's an example of a story. Some of them were transcribed in the reports he published. Here's one of the story of the tortoise and the king. Now, I don't know. This is the same recording I'm going to play for you. I'm not an Igbo speaker. You can tell me if this is... Anyone hear what the recording? The point is no one's checked back. Did anyone make sense of any of that? Yeah. Good. This is why we need you to help us, because actually no one's ever checked that these translations from 100 years ago were correct. No one's re-listened to these. You know, it's only now that they've been digitized that we can suddenly get them out there, as it were. So we need to help. He took, as I mentioned, thousands of photographs. About half of these were compiled in albums, four volumes covering the Igbo material. And I've just got some examples here to show you, pages from these albums that give you a sense of the kind of topics. Houses, topography, kind of village scenes from markets. He was interested in technologies and processes of making. So we have lots of sequence shots, for instance, of this one, a making of pottery. Decorative art, so we see the kind of uli, wall art and so on. Music, ceremonies, rituals, ceremonial objects, masquerades, very important people, the Ezenri. So again, in some senses, this is a kind of an anthropological documentation, but of course it's also a cultural heritage that's been captured, as it were, this moment in time. And as many of you will know, 1911 in Ri, particularly in terms of the relationship with the colonial authorities and traditional power, this was a key moment, because actually Thomas was there on the ground in Ri at the very time in which the powers of the Ezenri were removed or seriously curtailed by the colonial government. And Thomas was very critical of that kind of abuse, as he saw it, of colonial power. Many of the photographs that he took, about half of them, fall into this category, a particular genre of anthropological photography called the physical type. Okay, and these embody some of the kind of the worst ideas of this kind of colonial power relation, the reduction of individuals, of human beings, to types, racial types of this kind. And this was part of a project of mapping the physical differences between people. And these are difficult images to see, okay, today. When they were published, people's names didn't exist. Man of Orca, for instance, about 40 years old. etc. This is what we're left with. So again, the question here is, well, is that the only reading of these? Should this only represent, this kind of photography, for instance, just represent an embodiment of the kind of violences of colonialism and the objectification of people? Or can we look at these in other ways? It's one of the many questions we have. This material exists. It's in our archives. It's problematic. It's difficult. What do we do with it? And this project's trying to ask some of those questions. 5 minutes left. So some of the things we're trying to do with the project then are to retrace some of those itineraries made over 100 years ago by this guy Northcote Thomas, taking the photographs, taking the sound recordings. So this is some of the work I've been doing in Sierra Leone and in Edo State, in North Edo in Nigeria, taking some of these collections. So we're taking the photographs and the sound recordings from the particular town or village back to that particular place and trying to learn about them. And not only learn about the content, but learn what they mean today to different people. And similarly with the sound material. And some of the most powerful responses have come from listening to the sounds, more than the photographs in a way. But we're also trying to explore other ways of re-engaging with this collection, not just from a kind of a historical or an anthropological perspective, but what do they afford creatively, you know, to artists? We've heard from a number of artists and writers and so on today. How can artists, for instance, re-engage with this material? What would they do of it? What does it afford for them in terms of, you know, engaging with some of those difficult histories of colonialism that are embodied in these things? So we've been working, for instance, with the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. We've recruited a postdoctoral researcher from Nsukka. We're going to have a series of art workshops, for instance, with art schools such as in Nsukka and Auchi and elsewhere. And some of this work's already happening. So actually, the postdoc we've recruited is he's also an artist, and he's been playing around with some of these archival images. And one could debate the kind of recontextualization of these. So here's again a photograph, and again I won't play you the audio recording, but this instrument has a recording that Thomas made, and he's using collage and Photoshop and so on, recontextualizing that in terms of a string band that's based in Nsukka now. Chadikobi's already mentioned this, but actually Chadikobi and I know each other because I came to him because he'd actually found some of this Northcote Thomas material that had got out there onto the internet and started doing stuff with it, partly adding it to that database that we saw. But also, Chadikobi is very modest because he's also an artist, and he's been working with these images, and I was really interested. So whether that involves recoloring them to some degree, but doing some more kind of radical things with these images, you know. So this idea that we should not only respect the historical integrity of these things, but we should also be free to rethink the archive, be creative with it, try different things, maybe as a way of critiquing. So again, Chadikobi's work here, engaging with one of these physical type photographs, using art as a way of unpicking what's going on in there. And this is just a process we've begun. And I'm hoping that over the course, working with the Nigerian Arts Society, for instance, as well, that we can do much more of this kind of a thing, exploring what this archive, what these collections can do in the present for different stakeholders. And so this particular painting of Chadikobi's is juxtaposed with an exhibition at the Royal Anthropological Institute here in London, where some of these physical type photographs are exhibited. And the interesting thing here is that Northcote Thomas was very much involved in the Royal Anthropological Institute. And so this is the council room where the council of the institute, this august institution, meet. And there we are, the anthropologists of today are confronted with this difficult, problematic colonial past as they deliberate on their everyday business. Okay, I'll end there. My time's up. What I really would like to do is just return to that point. There's this website where I'm trying to put more and more of this material, and as the project goes on, more and more of it will become available online. But I'm pleading, please, get involved, okay? I don't know anything about this material. You know a lot more. The people we'll be working with in Nigeria and in Sierra Leone know a lot more. And what would be great is to, in whichever ways that you feel you're a stakeholder in this historical material, this difficult archive, to get involved and be part of exploring how we're re-entangled with it today. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Hi, Paul. Well done. That's what I'll say. I mean, I'm very much familiar with this, with Northcote Thomas' work. For about 10 years, I've been following it. Now, I want to point you out to something. Of the sound recordings, there's a recording that was made in 1909, made near Onitsha. And it was the earliest of his recordings in that area. Now, it was the voice of a man known as Ujozo Orapo, who was begging for help. He apparently had some form of canker, a canker sore, and he was asking for help. Obviously, Northcote Thomas wasn't a doctor and probably didn't understand what he was saying and probably didn't care anyway. But why is it significant? Because that was the earliest recording, as far as I'm aware. I'm not aware of any other sound recordings having been done before 1909.
In this area of Nigeria, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And so that would probably be the earliest sound recording, the voice of Ujozo Orapo. Please, I'll be happy to send it to you because I actually found it on the BL, on the British Library website.
Yep.
That's when I came about 10 years ago. And, this is incredible stuff, and looking at also the next comment I want to make, the photograph of Ezenri or Balike, that was really powerful because, as you very, very correctly pointed out, this was coincident with the demystification of Ezenri. On his journey to the provincial headquarters, where he was defenestrated, as it were, people ran on seeing him because you did not see Ezenri. As far as people were concerned, having seen Ezenri, the next thing you were going to witness was death, because he was such a sacred being, as it were. The Ezenri was such a sacred being. In fact, this legend, Ezenri Fininu, was supposed to have magical powers with the ability to fly. So to see Ezenri, as far as people were concerned, as he walked, as he was humiliated by the British colonial authorities, and as he walked to lose his powers, this was a poignant event. And seeing that photograph, it's emotional. I mean, I've seen several, but that is really, really powerful. I know you know, but please, I'm just going to remind them what the power you have in your hands with the archive and the responsible and proactive use you're putting it to deserves a standing an ovation. Please, well done.
I mean, it's just about recognizing, and this is one archive in many in our institutions like this, from all over the world. So thank you very much for that. Please do, yes, get in contact and we'll find the material you're talking about and understand it. There is an interesting anecdote about the Ezenri in particular. Thomas developed these in the field, the photographs. And it's interesting the relationship that one can see between the anthropologist and the people he was photographing. And an interesting point here that he records just in a letter was that he wouldn't accept receiving a copy of the photograph from Thomas's assistant, only from Thomas. I mean, just a minor thing, but there's little bits of knowledge tucked away, buried away in what might seem insignificant, archives here. So yes, please do. And no, I don't know is the answer to what you're saying. So please let us know. We can then, if it's appropriate knowledge, put it on the website. We have a blog. I'm encouraging everyone to be a guest blogger. So make a blog about that, and we'll increase our knowledge about what the value of this kind of material is. Thank you. I think there's
Hi, mine is a very quick question. What's the copyright status of the images that you've just shown us in the Sound Archive?
So these collections and archives are in the collections of different places. So as has been mentioned, for instance, the sound material is in the National Sound Archive, the British Library. Okay, some of the negatives are held by the Royal Anthropological Institute, some of the prints with the Cambridge Museum, etc., etc. So it's quite complicated. However, those institutions are very keen to engage with the kind of research that we're doing.
One of the reasons I was asking is because I noticed that Northcote Thomas died in 1936.
Yeah.
And the British copyright law is that after 70 years after death, that material should be in the public domain.
Yeah.
And the museum's asserting copyright ownership, which is...
Well, they're not. That's what I was kind of trying to say, is that through this project, what the museum, without getting into the technicalities of it, they'll say is that, well, the copyright of the original isn't there, but their digital copy, what they've made
which
available.
Is a way of
However,
controlling it.
These institutions, who are all collaborators in the project, all want to get this material out there and made freely
there's
available.
out there, and then there's also being freely able to use it. I mean, I was just saying that I also started off on Tumblr, digging through the crate, so to speak, through the archives. And by doing that, I was essentially contravening the copyright false copyright claim that a lot of museums put over material that should be in the public domain and should be freely available for everybody to use and share for free.
Sure.
And I would love, especially projects, especially academic projects who are getting public funding, I would love for academic projects working with Colonial Archives to recognise and make sure they assert that this stuff is in the public domain so people can freely use and share it.
No, fair point, and to assert that would be the thing, sure. I mean, to make that clear on the website.
There's a whole structure with museums,
Yeah.
libraries and archives using Creative Commons that is
Yeah.
about making sure licensing and the copyright status of archive material is obvious. So people like us Tumblers, like us bloggers can know that we can use it freely without being...
Okay, we'll work on that. Thank you.
Hello, Paul. Thanks so much for that. Just a quick question. Did you when you talked about the British Museum not wanting to... Yeah, can you just explain that more, why they didn't want it? What the significance of that was?
It's a tricky one, because it's all about also personalities and so on. So to see the British Museum as the institution and to see Thomas as the colonial anthropologist, in a way, gets it wrong. Because actually it was Charles Hercules Reed, who was the keeper of what was then the kind of ethnographic section, and Northcote Thomas. It was a kind of a disagreement between them in actual fact, okay? They were both peculiar characters. Thomas, and then you can reconstruct this through looking through some of the fragments of correspondence. Thomas seems to have regularly misunderstood what particularly people in authority told him. And he misunderstood, he thought he was collecting for the British Museum. He thought he had a budget from the British Museum of £50. In a letter I've seen that Reed reminds him that that was his collecting budget for his whole collecting budget for a year anywhere in the world. And why on earth did he think he should be spending all of that money there? However, he also says that the kinds of methods that he was collecting were not the kinds of material that they were after, okay? He was interested, he saw things as an anthropologist, not as an art connoisseur. So Thomas was interested in the everyday. I can't tell you how many hundreds of baskets or fish traps, everyday objects that were in these collections, okay? And this simply wasn't the kind of thing that the British Museum was interested in, okay? And Thomas says quite openly how he's buying stuff on the market, for instance in Benin City, and he's saying, well, the prices are up, I can't buy as many of these because, which challenges our perceptions about this idea, as I say, of the powerful colonial presence, as it were, looting this kind of material, bringing it back as treasure, as it were. Here's a case where he was, commissioning work, paying for it, and then griping over trying to get some reimbursement. So what happened was that it was offered to the British Museum. The British Museum, in the person of Reed, sent him away with his tail between his legs, as it were. It then got offered to the Pitt Rivers Museum, and then eventually to Cambridge, where Cambridge, again, at an individual level, the director of the museum at that time was interested in a kind of a sample of everyday material culture, and actually saw the value in this kind of more modest types of objects. So that's a bit more of the kind of context.
Hello, Paul. My name is Chike Azoni. I'm the Vice President of the Nigerian Art Society UK. I wanted to ask you, in a situation where people go to an Igbo village and take photograph of Uli, the murals, and then when they publish it, it has copyright. And some of these people travel all the way from Europe to a village in, say, Okigwe or Omuahi or Aba in the village and take photographs of things that the women do in Uli designs, and then publish it and have copyright of those designs which they did not originally own. How do you reconcile with that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the earlier question about Creative Commons, I think. This is now a historical archive, as it were, that I'm engaging with, or this project's engaging with, where it's precisely trying to do the opposite in terms of it's about, one, bringing this material together and then recirculating it. So it is, it is in the spirits of a Creative Commons type approach. In terms of historically, kind of, analysing what you're referring to, absolutely. I mean, it's another example of, a kind of a power disparity, how art can be appropriated, reproduced, and the artist's not even acknowledged. The names are not recorded, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very familiar, problematic context. I mean, in a way, this is the issue at the heart of the project. We've quite specifically looking at a colonial archive. And the question is can we go beyond that? What does it mean today in a very different context? I mean, it's a bit of a cheap comment I've got at the top here. I don't know if you can read it. Re-engaging with colonial archives in post-colonial times. I know the question of whether we're living in post-colonial times is debatable. And, someone earlier invoked the decolonizing times, and maybe that is a better way of framing this. But precisely, it's trying to say, what happens if we take this material out of the context in which it was assembled, okay, and think about specifically what it can do. The project is called Museum Affordances, which is kind of behind this. And it's this notion of affording. What does this material afford in the present? We will look at what's happening in the past, the time it was collected. What was it seen to afford in the past in terms of colonial governance, for instance? And it failed, really, to do any of what it was expected to do. But now, because of the fact that it's now it's a material legacy of that colonial moment, what can it do today when we're hopefully we've moved on from those times? So it's now being recirculated, and I hope again through this project and through opening the invitation to do stuff with this material that we can begin exploring that.